just running a little bit behind. Well, it's a beautiful day. Before we begin, is there anything that we need to mention in an opening prayer? I was looking through the bulletin, and I don't know if there's anything that needs to be added to this or not. It's hard to believe we're kind of knocking on the door of spring. Okay. Well, if there's nothing, Haley, do you mind to lead us in a word of prayer, please? Amen. Well, if you would, take your Bibles and turn to 1 Peter. We'll pick up there in chapter 3. And you'll remember that as we've gotten to this point, that Peter's encouraged the Christians that he's writing to, that their salvation was worthy of their troubles and tribulations and difficulties, that the choices that they'd made had been worthy of the eternal reward that they would be granted if they remained faithful. But where there's great rewards, there is responsibilities. So the responsibilities we got into last week and the week before was submission and a submissive spirit, submitting to, verse 13, government, and following that to submissive as servants in verse 18. And the duties and the responsibilities are carried over into chapter 3, and it's submission in marriage. So we tiptoed our toe in the water last week. We didn't certainly get through it all, but that's where we'll pick up this week. So let's read chapter 3, verses 1 through 8 again. And likewise, ye wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they also may without the word be won by the conversation of the wives, while they behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear, whose adorning, let it not be the outward adorning of plaiting of hair and of wearing of gold or of putting on of apparel, but let it be the hidden man of the heart, in that which is not corruptible, even the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great price. For after this manner in the old time the holy women also who trusted in God adorned themselves, being in subjection unto their own husbands. Even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters ye are, as long as ye do well, and are not afraid of any amazement. Likewise, ye husbands, dwell with them, according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife, as unto the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. Finally, be ye all of one mind, having compassion one of another, love his brethren, be pitiful, be courteous. And it goes on, but we'll stop there. So when we say submission, we've talked about it. What is our submission? What are we talking about when we use that word submission? What is that, Ron?
We subordinate our own will to that of someone else's.
Yep. Subordination's a really good word. Putting yourself under, if you will. Another way of putting it is making your will their will by choice. You're choosing willfully to have that same will of whoever you're submitting to. As we mentioned before, being in submission to our government, we've made that will our will. We're submissive to that will. We've subverted ourselves to that. We've chosen that for ourselves. Same thing as we're servants to masters, if you will, or today we'd look at it as being, as we're in business or employed or in those roles, that we make that will our will. We subvert ourselves and put ourselves into that position of, by choice, that we will carry that out by our will. And so marriage is much the same. So as a wife, as it says here, is in subjection to your own husbands, she, by her own will, has chosen this. And that's what Peter's instructing. Choose to be in subjection. And the purpose being, he makes a caveat to this, that if any obey not the word, that they may, without the word, be won by the conversation of the wives. Look at, well, I can actually, Randy's not here, but Romans chapter 1 and verse 16. Paul says there, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is" what? The power. So the power, the power that we have in the gospel, we know that it is to our salvation. But what's the second thing that is most powerful in our lives? Because Peter points it out here. The example that we live. Without the word, someone that's in the world that's not saved might very well see in action and conduct of this woman what they need to do to save their own souls. And that's a powerful thing. That's a powerful example. And so it's not something to be underestimated. So while they behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear, and we've all seen it, unfortunately, in our gatherings and across the span of time that we have, we've seen many in this situation within the church, where someone is converted and she comes in and her husband's not a member of the Lord's church, has never really taken interest in salvation for himself. But have you ever seen someone won over by the conversation, if you will, the conduct of a woman? Have you ever seen that? And we have. And it can go both ways, don't get me wrong. But here, specifically, Peter is telling the wives to be in subjection and submission to their husbands, that they might win them over. Now, in this time frame, of course, the time reference is that there was Christianity was basically 30 years old, if you would say. We're about 30 years out from the establishment of the church. So there was, as the converting was taking place, of course, all of them were being converted either from Judaism or a pagan life. And so certainly as the dispersion was taking place, and they were in many places outside of Jerusalem here, this might be actually one of the passages that is written more to a Gentile than a Jew, because of their conduct of a wife that's Christian being shown to that pagan individual can be a very strong example in converting from that standpoint. So it would be easy for some to lose faith in that at that time, and they might get discouraged in that. But the instruction is, be submissive. Any points and any observations in that?
I just want to read what the New American Standard
Mm-hmm.
on verse 2.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of fear, it says, as they observe the chaste and respectful behavior.
Yeah, respect. So I'm going to go through this whole passage, and then we're going to come back and compare that, because I would like to keep it to what God has said in terms of his instruction for us as the righteous, instruction, because we can look at it in our personal lives, and we can look at it in actually Scripture of, it's very easy to mess this example up in marriage. And so I'd like to keep it on focus on that. So so living in respect, living in submission, living in that, as the ladies in marriage have that chaste conduct. And it goes on down as she continues to adorn herself. Whose adorning, let it not be that outward adorning of plaiting of hair and of wearing of gold or on putting on of apparel. So at this time, that was a fairly common thing to do from the standpoint of plaiting of hair, literally putting ornaments in their hair of gold. It was done in the Old Testament certainly as well. But at this time, as it was practiced, it was really kind of a very worldly thing, very worldly. It was actually a lot of the harlots in the world at the time would plait their hair and make themselves look attractive. But we can also go in the putting on of apparel, literally wearing things that are outside of what your expectation is. And we can appreciate what that might be. If she was, we could make a very good example of that in our lives today, that if I walked in this morning in a tuxedo, half of you probably would fall out of your chair. And I would appreciate that, because that would be very much not expected. So the outward adorning that it's talking about here is trying to make oneself look like something you're not, for one. But this outward adorning can go both ways. It can go both ways. And sometimes the outward adorning can be basically focusing the attention on me when I'm coming into a setting of anything. So modesty is really something that it's talking about here, is living modestly. It's not being something you're not overdressing and making yourself look like the center of the attention, but also not underdressing either, because we have a culture today that is very pointedly casual. And that can be an attention-getting thing as well. So we should dress in terms of modestly, women, and certainly it applies. And for the reason being that the outward adorning is what? Yeah, it's physical. It's physical, it's carnal, it's all, these things are not spiritual. They are temporal. You can go down through the list of things. And that's what Peter goes to, that but, and I like the word but, because as I have been told in the past, and I've applied it, I'm not an English teacher. I'd be a terrible one. The only reason I passed my English class was because my beautiful wife helped me. And so, but I was told something, and it goes to the conversation that a lot of times that I'll listen to intently at home, is if she says but, or if anybody says but, that kind of like erases everything you just said, and it's like, listen to what I'm saying now. Right? If she says, I love you, but. ... So the but kind of resets the conversation. And it resets it and says, listen to what I'm saying now. And that's what he says here. But let it be the hidden man of the heart. What is the hidden man of the heart? Yeah, our spirit, our soul. But let that hidden man of the heart, our souls, our spirit, for wives specifically, in that which is not corruptible, that's not going to fade. As we say, this is not temporal. This is permanent. This is not going to, be done away with. It is going to go into eternity forward. Even the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great price. So we talk about meekness often. What is meekness? Strength under control, very much. I've heard other definitions, but I like that one the most. It's the easiest for me to always remember. But her strength is under control. She's very disciplined, if you will. She's chosen this. She could do differently, but she chooses not to. She's got her strength under control. And a quiet spirit refers to that submissive spirit that she's got. She's quiet from the standpoint of subverting herself, putting herself in her role as a wife. She's chosen this for herself. It's a great price in God's eyes. So, and why would that be a great price in God's eyes?
Well, that's what we're supposed to do. We're submissive to God. We're submissive to
Right. So this submissive spirit, the quiet spirit that she has, is we are submissive people in all these things, including wives here. God, that recognizes authority. Okay, she's recognizing the authority of her husband here, but she's also likewise going to recognize the authority that God has in her life. She's chosen this, and she's chosen him as well. So as she understands that, submitting to it, submitting to her husband, submitting to God, God sees her example as a valuable thing. Again, the power of our salvation's in the Word, but also the power of her example that she might actually lead others to God. That's a great price for God as well.
as a roadmap Christianity, a roadmap to God.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of put ourselves back in that period and look at it, just give us some perspective. Give us applied to today. Chapter 2 talks about submitting to the government, submitting to our bosses or people that are over us.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that goes to the male role. And typically has been a male role.
Mm-hmm.
And I love this because it brings in
Mm-hmm.
our mates or the women of the congregation to give them equal ground,
Mm-hmm.
to give them an understanding where they stand with God, and to help them to take part in what's being said. And I love this
Mm-hmm.
because it brings everybody together. And so I just, I want to say that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So we laid out, so here, in God's eyes, she's a valuable asset. And so from the standpoint, hearing that from God of the value that she has, let me back up to what we kind of laid the foundation of last week was, it's a very, very common thing within our culture and society that, we have this feminist ideology and this feminist thinking and, you're just be happy and just do your own thing. And it's just the erosion of the values of a moral home, which starts with a loving husband and wife and yields loving children. Then, I back up and say, what has that done to our culture abroad? It's eroded the value of women. They say they're feminists and all this other, but she's absent many, many things by virtue of this culture and this ideology, and victimized, quite frankly, and depraved from many things that she is because of that ideology. It's a very shallow thought. It's a very shallow ideology, very lax morals from that standpoint. But here God establishes her value. And when we deviate from that, and when we deviate from the truth, we lose that value. And so I laid that groundwork to consider, there's value in her role, and God defines it and says she's of a great price for this. So from that standpoint, it's kind of a principle. Once we leave the truth of God's Word and start redefining things as we see fit, it's a slippery, slippery slope that we get on every single time. So, Kathy?
Dealing at this point, I'm a little off topic, but if we go back to Genesis,
Yeah.
God created man, and then he decided that man shouldn't be alone, and he created woman, not to take over, but to be a help.
Yep.
So we were created to be a help to man,
Yep.
not to be his boss.
Yep. We're going to get to some of that. That's very true. Yeah. We'll come back to that, because I'm going to go back to that example here in a minute. Because again, this is the godly example that we have. This is godly instruction. This is a righteous path, if you will, as women submit themselves in this. She's valued greatly in God's eyes. Anything else before we move down just a little bit more?
If you're attracted to a man because of your outward appearance, you're there for the wrong reason.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to get your
Mm-hmm.
reward.
Yeah.
But you're attracted to a man because of the purity of your heart.
Mm-hmm.
Now you're living your life.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the recipe for success in marriage. And it's hard as an 18 or 20-year-old man to be thinking that way, truthfully. I understand that. But trained in a godly home, there will be that foundation laid.
But today, that's today's society.
Mm-hmm.
Because, there's all degrees of nudity and
Mm-hmm.
permissiveness and
Mm-hmm.
everything else down
Mm-hmm.
there. That it may not be in existence here because they took this more seriously than we do.
Yep. Yep. And that's a lesson we can learn. It is serious. It is that serious. Look at verse 5. For after this manner in the old time, the holy women also, who trusted in God, adorned themselves, being in subjection unto their own husbands. Even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. Now, this is interesting. Whose daughters ye are. That's an interesting point that Peter puts in here. As long as ye do well and are not afraid with any amazement. So he offers the example, Sarah and Abraham. And she was respectful to him. She is mentioned as being an example because, honestly, when they lived in the Ur of Chaldees, they're called out to go. Abraham says, we're going to go. Well, he had to go home and tell Sarah, we're going to move. We're going to go. Well, where are we going? Where were they going? I don't know. Now, if I went home to my wife and said, you know what? We're going to go. Okay, well, where are we going? I don't know. How much faith does that take in Sarah to say, okay, okay. She was submissive, trusting. She had the spirit that we're talking about here and respected him, calling him Lord. So it's a powerful example in marriage of submission, faith, trust, love. She adorned herself in that. And as God said, she was of a great price. But if those that do this, and it's Peter's writing to the wives of this time, but it also applies today, whose daughter ye are. That's very, very interesting that Women that are doing this now, whose daughter ye are, like Sarah. Daughters. Looking forward to the same reward as she has. Any points up until verse 7, because we're going to change gears after that. Yep. Go ahead.
I think when you look at chapter 2 and chapter 3 together, one of the things we see is this: being a Christian doesn't give you superiority in this world.
Right.
We're to be humble.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And we see in our society today that everyone wants to, I don't want to wear a mask, I don't want to do this, and as Christians, we have to submit, not take the authority the same way
Mm-hmm.
a wife that's married to a non-Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't make her a better person, and therefore I don't have to listen to you because you're not a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
We live humble lives as Christians.
Yep.
And that's the whole idea of, a lot of people think if we want to control the world, we can't control
Oh,
the
no.
world. That's not our job, to build a Christian nation, to be in control.
Yep.
But we're to live peacefully.
And that's a good point, because we can perhaps be in that point of more so, but by faith. It's not anything that we do ourselves. If God allows it, if God's blessing is such, then, and that's a very trusting thing that we have to have too, but it's a good point. It's very much true. And as I mentioned last week, that, we don't have the right to just go down and start burning buildings and rioting and subjecting our authority over our government just because we think it's an immoral government. And it is an immoral government, but we are submissive to it. We're submissive to it. And we have the right then to vote and change it because we live in a democratic society to be able to do that. So that's a good point. Very good point. Rick?
But then one of the things that is a challenge for Christian men and women, in reflection on what she's been said, is this goes against the society that we live in.
It
It's
does.
not, the push for what's called equality
Mm-hmm.
and rights has
Mhm.
made it very difficult for some people to understand submission. But here's what's interesting. Some people see submission, wife submitting to her husband, or us submitting to one another, or
Mm-hmm.
government. Sometimes that's viewed as weakness. Oh, you're weak, that's why you're submissive. No, really, to be submissive is a position of strength.
It is.
It is the rising above even society. And if you look at Jesus, and his humility demonstrated, it wasn't that he was weak. It was that he was strong enough to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Very good point, because it is. It takes strength and to remain in those marriages, as Christian wives were at that time. Even as it was, like it mentioned back in chapter 2 with servants, even if they're bad masters, you don't have the right to usurp that to both the meek and to the harsh, as it said. So same thing, husbands could be viewed similarly. Sometimes we're not nice, and sometimes there's others that are. And in these marriages, the wife is to be submissive by choice, and that takes a strong person. But to lead her husband to Christ is the example. That may be the only example that he's got, maybe the only chance he's got. And so we have seen that in action, and it's a powerful thing. Yep.
Scripture comes to mind as freer to give than to receive. And what freer gift we have to give of our soul to another.
Yeah. Having seen women that are in that situation, there's nothing more that they would want to see than their spouse convert. It's a good point. Anything else? Verse 7. Likewise, ye husbands. This is kind of getting personal now, so let me kind of ease into this section. Likewise, ye husbands, dwell with them, according to the knowledge, giving honor to the wife, as unto the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. Let me back up. So, dwell with them. Does this violate anything that's been ever taught on God's law of marriage? Perfectly harmonizes with everything that's been taught from Genesis chapter 3. Dwell with one another. There's no, well, yeah, but, as we have today, so many exceptions. Dwell with her. I have no right to put my wife out just because she burned the toast this morning. I don't have as Missouri law says, no need for giving a reason to dissolve your marriage. I don't have that right. Dwell with her. I have the righteous instruction that I am to dwell with her. Because it would have been in that day and age easy not to if someone was, again, not a Christian. That's not an exception to this. If my wife, as we take on marriage, my duty as a husband is I dwell with her. Period. I don't get to trade her in like a new car every now and then. That's the culture we live in. It's terrible. Instruction is, as a husband, I'm committed, I dwell with her. The next part's a little harder. Being married 32 years, I don't have as much time as some of you, but with understanding. That's a tough one, isn't it? Because us guys, we just don't think the same as women. It's taken me a long time to understand my wife. It takes me a very selfless thing to think of what she would want. What's her needs? What's her desires? And that's what Peter's telling them here. For husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge or understanding them. What's other ways that sometimes we can understand them? Because I'm just asking, because I'm not a perfect husband. But like I said, if I take the focus off myself and I look at her needs and her desires and what she's to be fulfilled, then I think that is to try to understand her too.
Their desire to be children of God and God, I think is one that always comes up in my mind is I have to allow or stand back whenever she has her relationship with God.
Mm-hmm.
She sees a strong desire to serve in certain areas that I may not have time to work with. So she has this desire. That's one area. Of course, their strengths and their weaknesses.
Mm-hmm.
But we have our strengths and our weaknesses.
Right.
So that goes two ways.
Yeah, it does. It does. Yep. It is. It is. And it's that selflessness and love that you see the needs of another, the agape love. Yep.
I think about reading this and think about it. I think about Paul wrote in Ephesians 5.
Yes.
And that's talking especially to husbands,
Yep.
we're to treat our wives the way the Lord treated us.
Yep.
And if you're able to do that,
Yep.
you have to learn. Most of us, that's a learning experience. If you've done it 32 years, that's good. I got 59.
I know. And that's why I'm asking. You got twice as much time to reflect on it. So I appreciate that. Yeah, Ephesians chapter 5 is a perfect parallel to this. So, but women also, I do think, understanding from the standpoint of a man, our duty as a husband is to protect, correct? Right? Provide for, correct? And as we do that, offering that security in a home and provision, and then if we look to them for understanding and understanding them so that we have, because part of the understanding too, I think, is also giving her authority to do what she can do too. So she's in submission to me, but as I've understood her, allowed her to carry out her work and her life is an empowering thing for her. And so that is also something that, as men, understanding her helps her to be fulfilled. As unto the weaker vessel.
One of the things I was going to say is a lot of times men, husbands,
Not me, right?
they look out, they would never let an intruder into their home. You know, someone, they're online,
Mhm.
someone was trying to break in or something like that.
Mhm.
But oftentimes neglect the spiritual intruder
True.
that's going to come into the house
Mhm.
and change the dynamic of the family or allow something in, whether it be a television program, internet access, you know, things in the physical world that spiritual protection
Mhm.
sometimes is not there. And that can be a downfall.
It can be just more dangerous.
We're talking about the, you know, God's plan here. And as men, there needs to be physical protection for the family, the wife, and spiritual protection also.
It's a good point. That's a good point. Goes back to Kathy's help me point. Oh, so as Christy said, you know, I do. I mean, if there's someone that comes on my property, if the dog barks, I take a look. What is it? I will die if someone were to come in and try to do something in my home to steal, thieve. Just don't, because I will defend her and I will die. I have no problem with that at all. That is my role, and I understand that. Taking that on and putting it into the spiritual realm as a protector of my home, it's awful easy for us to neglect these things that are technological nowadays. We allow the TV to be on channels, and we allow for movies to, you know, and I don't say I do, but I'm not saying that we are, but I'm saying it's very easy to let access to immorality in many, many different forms just walk right in the front door. Come right in on the internet stream. And we as men have the duty to protect our families from that just as much as anything else. And in fact, I would say it's more rife in that form in our families and dangerous from that standpoint. But we are very good typically to protect physically, but you're right, it needs to take every single form.
There's a book saying that behind every great man is a great woman.
Yeah.
But I'm going to open up a little bit of a can of worms
Yeah.
here. I know it's late. But there are a lot of great women that their men are submissive, so to speak.
Yes.
I don't know that that's the way that it is in their congregation or their scripture. But you see women running for Congress, you know, back in the day, Lydia had said, or Purple, you know, prominent women.
Mm-hmm.
And it's spoken of several times in the scripture, particularly the prominent women. And so there is that role for a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't take that away from any woman that has that ability or capability to do that. And so I think that we sometimes in the church think that women can't rise to power.
Right.
And that's not the truth.
Mm-hmm.
No. But in the sight of the Lord, we learn a different role,
Mm-hmm.
so to speak. But it doesn't mean that they can't both coincide.
Yep. It's a good point. It's a role. I think that's the key. And as women have that role, it's a valuable role. a very valuable role. Let me move on just a little bit so we can get through this a little bit. As a weaker vessel, you know, and I say that to say this, like a vase. That's really literally what it's referring to here in the language. If someone was to come up my driveway in the middle of the night looking to steal or kill or be violent towards me or my household, would I go put a vase on the front porch? Just think about that. My role as a husband is to treat my wife as that and protect her, and we wouldn't put the vase on the front lines, that's what I'm saying. As defensive, we understand how we treat that vase. You know, it's got a really valuable place in most people's homes, and we put it up on a mantle, and we might look at it from the standpoint of the value. It's got a beauty. It's very delicate. It's not to be misused. But those are all things. And then notice that he says as being heirs together. And I think if we understand that we're heirs together, how much more value that puts on her soul. And I'm as to protect that your prayers be not hindered. So let me go back. So we have proper instruction here of success in terms of that marriage, in terms of submission. And I mentioned it last week. We've got many, many examples that we can go to that are bad examples, if you will, of marriage throughout the Old Testament. But it kind of goes back to some of what we talked about. It goes back to Genesis chapter 3. Did Adam lead his household like he should have? Did he tell Eve when she proposed the sin of bringing the fruit to him? Did he stand up and say, "What are you thinking?" No. He took it. She offered it. He took it. So he wasn't leading like he should have. But herself also proposing that to him was also taking a step out of line in terms of her doing that. So we see there a disconnect. But we can go through many, many, many different examples. Let me back up to a good example of which I was trying to think of ahead of time, of submissive wives. You know, the chaste conversation of a converting spirit, if you will. And the best one that I could think of was King Xerxes and Esther. You know, how she won him over was how? I hear whispering. How did Esther win the king? Because many, many people were subverting her and didn't want this marriage to be had, but she won him over. Huh? She was a godly woman. Go ahead. Yeah. She was a godly woman. Yep. In submission. Yep. Yep. So a godly example of that I thought was a very good one from the standpoint of her submission to him and won him over. I think of Jacob and Rachel from the standpoint of his work for her. 14 years. So there's some examples there, certainly as it offered Abraham and Sarah. Just real quickly, but I mentioned last week, read 2 Samuel chapter 6, because there's an example there of a real mess of a marriage, David and Michal. But we'd be well reminded that she was not submissive to him, but also that David also was not respectful of her and did not understand her as a husband. But you can go back and look at the marriage and the turbulent marriage that it was. It was a mess, and it was yielded then in his children and his household to follow. But anyway, appreciate all the good comments. We'll pick up there next week in verse 9 and move forward from there.